Hello, and welcome to Lore Watch, a roundtable freeform discussion about lore in your favorite media. I'm your host, Joe Perez, one of several lore-focused folks from Blizzard Watch, and I've got my marvelous co-host with me today, Matt Rossi. How you doing today, Matt?
I need a talking tiger who wears a green suit.
So you want to be He-Man?
No, who wears a green suit, not a green
tiger.
Oh, No, you are thinking of Cringer, a.k.a. Battle Cat, who, by the way, wouldn't mind having. But no, I was thinking Mr. Talkie Tawny from Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel.
Oh my goodness, I haven't thought of that in aeons.
Every so often I go back and read not just the original stories, but I read different versions that I've seen over the years, like the Jerry Ordway run on it, and I can't remember his name, but he's incredibly famous. He's the guy who's doing it most recently. He was the one who did Jeff Johns. There we go. Jeff Johns' version. I don't know about Jeff Johns' version. I don't think it's awful, and I do sense a lot of he definitely seems to like the character and likes doing stories with a more lighthearted bent than his usual everybody dies, oh my god, this is horrible kind of storytelling. But at the same time, it still feels weird to me. I don't think he can really get over the fact that he can't be called Captain Marvel.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something there. And I was actually...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I was actually going to propose this and see if maybe our listeners at home are interested. I wanted to do another comic book episode pretty soon. I have been reading the new Ultimates because I just restarted the Ultimate Universe, and I find the way they're doing it extremely fascinating. And I would love to sit down and chat about it, in particular things with Iron Man, Doctor Doom, and Spider-Man, of course, because there's a lot of really interesting things that I think are a really cool reinvention of some of the mythos of these creations. So if you're interested, we can maybe do an episode on comics coming up here relatively soon. And if you at home are interested, we could do an episode on those really soon. Just let us know.
Yeah. Well, they'll be up front. I'll do pretty much anything. So just let us know if you're interested.
But today we're not going to be talking about comics, although we probably could. We're going to be answering you, our wonderful listeners' questions. If you have questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send those in to podcast@blizzardwatch.com. If you are a Patreon subscriber, you get a little bit of a bonus. Not only can you contact us through Patreon, but you can also go on our Discord server, and you can sub on the Patreon Q and Podcast Questions channel. If you're not a Patreon subscriber and you don't like email, we do have another channel set aside for you. It's the Q and Podcast Questions channel. In all cases, we ask that you do a couple things. 1, let us know what show it's for. 2, if there's a special pronunciation for your name, please give it to us. Otherwise, Matt and I are likely to mangle it in hilarious ways,
Matt.
Likely.
Yeah, Joe at least will attempt to sit down and sound it out. I will just charge through that word and then go, wait a minute, no, that doesn't make any sense. There's a Z in there.
Well, speaking of Z's, we're going to start with one from Metal Zani. Knowing there were tunnels to the northern kingdoms of Azj-Nerub that were sealed when Anubarak asked for aid, do you think we would get to explore more of Azj-Nerub while we are up there in Ulduar, since the giant underground Titan facility is right next to it? Matt, do you have an opinion on that? Do you think we're going to get to see more of that stuff?
I have no idea. It would certainly be something we might get in this expansion, since stuff from that expansion is kind of recurring and we're getting new information. It's always interesting to consider that, we don't really know the location of these places in relation to each other before everything went to Boop. Sometimes they got moved and sometimes they didn't. I think it's fair to say that it feels like it wasn't just a sublimation of most of the continent. It feels like big chunks of the continent got pushed apart. So I don't know. The simple answer to the question is I don't know. I could certainly see it happening. I could also certainly see it not happening. But I definitely think it would be interesting to get to see the difference between, Azj-Kahet and, Azj-Nerub. Like, why are these places, there's different Nerubians. Why? Are they, considered, the same people to each other? Or are they, rival nations? How does that work? Did each of the old gods have their own Nerubians or own Karaji or whatever? They had their own insect people, or arthropod people, I guess we should say. And, how do the Lobstrock fit in? I want to know, are the Lobstrock related? I don't care about anything as much as I care about the Lobstrock. I need to know more. That was a bit of a joke, but at the same time, I would actually like to find out if the Lobstrock are related to the various arthropod races that seem to come from the old gods. There's a lot of this that I'm interested in. We had a conversation a long time ago now about how, technically speaking, it's starting to feel like the story of this expansion is making me wonder if any of the quote unquote old god races are.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit at length, because were they created by the old gods, which don't seem to actually create anything. In fact, I think that's one of the hallmarks of them, is they don't create, they just sort of warp. Or did they take something that existed and just warp it? And which is why, I don't want to say it like this, but for lack of a better term, Azeroth's immunity system hasn't exactly expunged all of them from herself.
Yeah, and that would make sense, because that's something that we actually see. I think I started thinking about this with G'huun, because G'huun was all, like, honestly, to me, G'huun didn't feel like its own independent old god. No. G'huun felt like if you took the vector of transmission for old gods and made it a being.
Which is kind of what it was.
Yeah, but if you think about what that says, that means that old gods infect things.
Mm-hmm.
Which we've already kind of seen for Azeroth itself. But if they infect things and hijack them the way viruses do, that's what a virus does. It infects a cell, finds its genetic equipment, and uses that to make more of itself instead. That could be kind of what's going on with all these different old god created races, with quotes going. And what we have with the Nerubians is an example of a species that was done to them. And then they eventually recovered their ability to be independent again. Because they obviously, when the old gods were like, okay, we're going to war, they were like, no thanks. We'd rather not. You can fight that one without us. We're going to be over here. And yeah, that's great. And we see that in both Azj-Kahet and Azj-Nerub. Azj-Nerub, they're terrified of the old god servants. They don't worship them. Like when I'm not going to be able to remember his name. He's literally, I think, mentioned in this email. When he and Arthas were going... Anubarak. Yeah, my brain got to it after my brain almost always figures it out once I stop trying. But anyway, when Anubarak and Arthas were going under the mountain and the faceless thing comes out, Anubarak is like, ah! And Arthas is like, kill, kill, kill. What the heck is your problem? Like, sorry, it's just they're scary.
I got trauma, bro. Like, leave.
Yeah.
So
exactly. So I do think there's a possibility of us seeing it, but I do wonder if it means that we're going to eventually find out at the end of this expansion that all the races of the Black Empire are not this, yay, old gods, kill everything, monster, blah. But they actually have their own identities and their own feelings, and to a certain degree, each of them are in their own relation to the old gods, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something there too, and I think we're seeing a little bit more of that, especially in this expansion, especially at the beginning part, as we're making our way through Azj-Kahet, and as we're making our way through the current raid tier. And mild spoilers if you haven't finished the raid tier, it is available on the Raid Finder. Highly recommend you do it, if nothing else, for the last cinematic, if you haven't seen it. But you essentially are freeing the people from like devotion to their current queen, which didn't murder the old queen, but transformed her into a gibbering monstrosity that is just in constant pain. We don't know if it can be reversed, but you've basically freed them, or at least a handful of them, from control or influence of Xal'atath. There's going to still be some cleanup to do there, but they are their own people. They were before Xal'atath got there. The queen really just said no, which is why she died, and her daughter why her daughter killed her and took over. But after that is said and done, maybe towards the end of this expansion, we might see ourselves getting more information from them, because there's a common thread, I think, between when we're talking about the races of like Azj-Nerub and Azj-Kahet and the Arathi. They're explorers. They travel wide and far. The the basically the Nerubians just do it underground. We've seen complex city structures, complex travel structures that mimic that of, I would say, very close to what I would consider the Underdark in D&D, right? Which is essentially a world beneath the world. And it's safe to assume that even if, going back to what Matt talked about with like the plate shifting and continents moving and stuff like that, that doesn't necessarily mean that the underground did as much. And so there might still be complex network structures that we can tap into.
They might have even done more after the Sunder.
Correct. And also, let's not also forget that the old gods were a burrowing mess. We also have the roots of Ganir. What is it? Ganir? I always mispronounce it.
Yeah, the original tree before the tree.
Which we know
Ganir was the thing that was the ancestor to all the world trees.
Which we know we have roots of. Which we know we have roots of in the area of Azj-Kahet. Like, that is flat out stated in some of the questing and some of the other outside sources that comment on it, that those are like vestiges of the roots of Ganir. So, with all of those things pushing through the crust of, or the shell of Azeroth, as it were, they definitely left cavities. They definitely left tunnels and holes when the old gods were contained and pulled back, right? When Ganir was not necessarily pulled away, but was severed from essentially this particular plane of existence and then needing to be replaced with the other world trees. I'm paraphrasing. I highly recommend you go back and listen to our world tree episode if you want to know more about it. So there could be a very complex structure of tunnels that we can use to explore. And think about what that means, right? Like, it's a lot easier, and I'm relatively easier than navigating the waters of Azeroth, at least from what we've seen. It can be extremely volatile. And let's also not forget that our favorite once High Elven queen, now Queen of the Naga, Azjara, is still out there too, and she is absolutely shown to have immense power over water and weather without the old god's help at this point. This might be slightly less treacherous for a caravan to go from point A to point B, and we might have ready-made guides. And again, going back to it, we just freed them from oppression, essentially. They're going to owe us a little bit, or at least that's kind of how this story beats usually work out. And it would be interesting to see us get something from them as opposed to us just essentially murdering them or murdering the undead versions of them. Because that's the other thing too. Like Anubarak and a bunch of the other Nerubians, they're undead.
Yeah, they're dead now.
Right? Like, even when they were animated, even though when they were working for Arthur, they weren't necessarily, or Arthas, they weren't necessarily alive. So, yeah.
I'm pretty sure Anubarak was dead when you first meet him.
He was.
Because he was under the control of the actual original Lich King. And then Arthas buddied up with him. He got killed, and then Arthas brought him back. So Arthas like, no, you don't stay dead. I want you up. Which actually goes to show the problem with dealing with undead. Sometimes you can do all the killing you want, and they just come back. So yeah, we could actually see Anubarak again at some point. We could even see him in this.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I don't know what the future will bring, but I do think that the one thing for sure is we're probably going to have a new relationship with the current Nerubians in some way that will give us more information regarding this. I don't think the Titan facilities, and I don't think that the Titan Watchers or any of the Titan Forge will be happy to see them, because I believe that they've all been programmed to essentially eradicate on site or contain. But yeah, we'll see what happens. Hopefully that answers your question, or at least somewhat, or gives you some more speculation to go on. Our next question comes from Scribbly, or Scribble. I hope that is correct. Given that the Earthen do not have the same Scottish-like accent that the dwarves do, can you speak about the choice the game has made regarding accents? Furthermore, could you talk about the choices around in-world language in general? I'm going to let Matt go on a tear about this one if he has any opinions, because I think we've talked about this a little bit before.
I'm going to focus a little bit more on the elves and the elven language than I am on, say, the dwarven stuff. But I will say this much. I don't think that the frost dwarves have a particularly Scottish accent either.
They do not.
I think the weird Scottish accent, I mean, obviously, out of game, we know it's just a choice they make. Just like the choice to make trolls sound vaguely Jamaican or what have you. And we can put aside certain discussions just because they don't really have much to do with the in-game lore. But I am aware of how offensive it can kind of be to just hear an entire regional accent or dialect booted down into flavor for a group of non-humans in a video game. I am not unaware of that. I think that I'm going to have to make a segue over to Dragon Age for a second here, just for one of the more interesting things I've ever seen in that regard, which was from the get-go, dwarves all had American accents. And partially that was because dwarves were all usually played by Americans. Like just American or Canadian voice actors played most of the dwarves. The biggest one being Brian Bloom, who is fairly well known in voice acting. I'd be willing to say that, right? Brian Bloom's pretty well known.
Yeah, I would think so.
Mostly for Varric Tethras, but he's also played Captain America. He's done a lot of things. So I think that choice in casting then affected the story in that quote-unquote surface dwarves were almost all American accented, and the underground dwarves tended to still not be very Scottish. Like, I don't think, like there's an Ogren who is just an odious, unpleasant person, but also relatively loyal. The Ogden has good points too. He's not just a horrible scumbag. He just happens to be a horrible scumbag who is still somewhat likable. Played by Steve Bloom, who you may know is the voice of Mephisto. So I feel like that set them in a direction. And in WoW, one of the first voice actors to play a dwarf played him with a Scottish accent. And I think to a certain degree, that's a holdover from Tolkien. And as a result, dwarves were just Scottish for the longest time. That's just how they sounded. Everybody who did one tried to sound like that first voice actor. In lore, we have to remember that the dwarves that we find in Ironforge and in Grim Batal and even the Dark Irons all come from the ones that were in a similar installation in Uldir. I mean, in Uldaman. They all come from that. They're all either ones that followed down with Tyr and his people or ones that were found in there. But either way, they're isolated. They're an isolated people. And what happens when isolated people spend a long time isolated? They develop their own culture. They develop their own language. And I think one of the things we might find out as we go through this expansion is that a lot of the stuff they developed is a holdover from the original Earthen that were there. We can surmise this by the simple example that we know that the Earthen transmit information about their culture through memory crystals. So they don't have drift. Like when they learn about their past, they tend to learn about their past from a direct infusion of memory of someone who got a direct infusion of memory before them. So the transmission was much less. They're not playing telephone as much, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Joe, you said yeah.
So there's also an element here that I think this is a question that's been asked a lot about just media in general and dwarves, right? Dwarves being portrayed with a Scottish accent as early as, some animated stuff, usually largely associated with John Rhys Davis playing Gimli in the Lord of the Rings and the Peter Jackson movies. Where it just sort of like happened. But even before those movies existed, it was a very common trope. Like books written from dwarven perspectives were often written with, I'll call it a pseudo Scottish accent because it isn't necessarily a true Scottish accent. And so there's an element.
It's kind of what you get if you are trying to do a Scottish accent, but you're really bad at it.
Yes.
And I'll be upfront here. When I do a Scottish accent, that's what it sounds like. I do it, and it's just awful. Nobody. What language are you even trying to do? Oh no, he's Russian now. Yeah. Like seriously, it's that bad. I've seen some sources saying that even in the Lord of the Rings cartoon that Bakshi did, the dwarves had American accents.
They did. They absolutely did. I actually just recently rewatched that not too long ago. But the interesting thing is some of this is actually born from real world stereotypes that existed before anything really codified it inside of media, right? So these are going to be a little bit out there, but these are often associated with why this is the case. So just kind of bear with me. So dwarves are often portrayed in fantasy writing as techie engineering or masonry types, right? Like they're always associated with some form of engineering, some science, metallurgy, geology. Interestingly,
hold on. Let me just throw one thing in here before you keep going.
Go ahead.
I want to put a pin on this. Think about Scotty from Star Trek.
I was going to get there.
Now go ahead.
Yeah. So for all of you there, keep this in mind. But the interesting thing is, like, geology is a science that is often like credited as starting in Scotland, because Scotland is a very hilly, mountainous, rocky area. It's not exactly that does have highlands, but it's not necessarily a soft, land, or like doesn't have like the plains that we have here in, the States in some areas or other parts of the world. There's an association with that.
Rolling hills of England, which is where most of the people who first oppressed the Scottish would have been from.
Exactly. During the time of the steam engine, most of the steam engineers, like on record, were Scottish, which is a weird true fact that I learned in like American history, like way long ago. But like, so there's that. And there's also the stereotype of Scotland being associated not just with the mountainous regions, but also hard drinking, and dwarves in popular fantasy, even before Tolkien, are often portrayed as hard drinking and living in mountains. So there's
go to Norse myth, guys. That's exactly what Norse myth says they're doing.
Exactly. And this is also why Norse Viking like portrayals are often not too far away from how dwarf verbiage is. Some have done it better, but it's like a watered down, I don't want to say a watered down version, a drifted version of it. It's very fascinating. So there's a lot of that sort of colors it. And so when dwarves were being created for World of Warcraft, in particular, Warcraft 2, where we had dwarven engineers and sappers, I think they were demolitionists. I apologize. Warcraft 3, where there were a lot more dwarves, plus the mountain thing, like you had a lot more of that influence started to come in too, partially because the people who were doing the voice acting for it and doing those voice lines, I'm looking at you, Bill Roper, where they grew up reading those books where that was how they were characterized. And then if you go back though, and interestingly enough, if you read original Tolkien, the dwarves aren't written like that at all. They're not. It's just pure clean verbiage with a few things in there. They're not walking around saying the stereotypical like, oh, Lottie and stuff like that. But it's interesting to see how real life stereotypes sort of like bled into it, because I remember even as a kid, before I had seen the Lord of the Rings movies or anything like that, because they didn't exist when I was young, that when I played a dwarf in D&D, I went for a Scottish accent. And it was because that's how I read it in books. Anything else to add to that, Matt? Because I know you want. I cut you off a couple times there, so I apologize.
No, that's fine. I wanted to make sure that I did shut up and let you go. I will say only that it's also interesting to think about. There's two things. One of them is a complete side tangent, but I blame Chris Claremont to a certain degree for the idea that all Scottish people talk and because Chris Claremont, when he writes dialect, he just takes letters out of the words madcap.
Yeah.
Like I've been to Scotland. Most Scottish people have absolutely no difficulty speaking English intelligibly, even if they speak Scots or Gaelic as a first language, which not that many do. Most of them do speak English as their first language, but it's not a problem. They don't all, they're fine. They're not a problem. It's us. It's not them. And secondly, I do think that to a certain degree, it just comes from that stereotype, like I want to call you Jim for some reason. What the hell, Joe? I think it's because we mentioned Star Trek, because I was about to talk about Scotty again.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations on being Kirk, I guess. Anyway, I think there's a certain amount of like that idea that people who were technicians and engineers and so forth tended to be Scottish in England at least for like a couple hundred years.
Yeah, and so
I do think that it's interesting to think about how that level of prejudice. Oh yeah, the Scots are like weird, stunted people who live in caves. No, that's the dwarves.
And also to kind of not put it too fine a point on it, just to go back to some of the other influences that definitely when creating World of Warcraft were there was Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, basically any setting that wasn't Dark Sun
D&D.
for D&D that Gygax written was written with that in mind. Like, that's what Gygax's inspiration was, including an early 1950s fantasy novel that basically had a Scottish adjacent dwarf. So like, there again, it goes back to that as well. It's fascinating to see where it comes from. Now, going back to the other part of the question, and I think Matt's right, is at least in the context of Warcraft, if we wrap the accent in that, everything in game sort of fits an odd stereotype, right? Like, when you talk to the Kultirans, their accent is very much that what you would expect of a seafaring people. A lot of shorthand, a lot of I hate to say cutting out letters for the sake of cutting out letters, but when you're on a ship and you're giving commands, the length of time you have before something goes wrong is not exactly, like, vast. So you might cut off words and imply meaning, or have jargon that you would put in place of it. And if that's your entire culture, those sailors carry that home with them. And then when they're home with it, they're used to talking to other people that maybe not necessarily are sailors, are like that. And so the society sort of adopts it when the vast majority of their personnel are sailors to begin with. Look at the folks of the Eastern Kingdoms, right? They're not dwarves. They have a very Middle English accent, I guess would be the best way to put it. Matt, would you agree with that?
I'd say it depends on who they are. Like, obviously, the kings tend to go for that same kingly voice that everybody does in every video game.
Yeah.
The average person, you can have a perfectly normal speaking English voice, or you can have job's done, sir. There's a wide range within there, but they're all basically Midlands English stereotypes or Northern English stereotypes. Mm-hmm. There's a definitely like Yorkshire and Newcastle type sound to some of them. Which I actually also think you get more in Gilneas, for that matter. They got a lot of Northern English stuff in Gilneas.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. And then you have, if we're going to go that same route, there's I just had it on the tip of my tongue and I'm going to forget it, the trolls. Look at the difference between the Talangi's people, where for whatever reason I'm blanking on the name. I'm sorry, folks, I have not had nearly enough caffeine today.
Zandalar.
The Zandalari trolls and the Darkspear trolls, they're similar, but there's drift. And that drift is, again, you can kind of explain it, right? So the Zandalari trolls, that's where they originated from. And they had their roots and they had their culture, that sort of their positioning, where they were, the type of wars they would lead, sort of.
The Zandalari can be seen kind of as a relic population, too.
They've
been on that island this whole time. They haven't gone really certainly after the Sundering, they have not really left very much. And even before that, they didn't conquer. The Troll Empire wasn't formed by Zandalari going anywhere. It was formed by subsidiary trolls groups going out and becoming their own thing. So each group that went out changed to fit its new location and changed the way it spoke, because they were just isolated again.
Exactly, and I was gonna hit on that point too, because I think that's important. It's like the Amani trolls do not sound like the Darkspear trolls. They're similar, but there's drift. And the Amani were they were warlike. They were very much more overt warlike, and a lot of their language seems to be based around, again, giving that sort of like imperious command tone while they're out in the field. Then you have the Darkspear, who are a quieter, softer spoken troll dialect, because their culture is roughly dominated by shadow hunters and shadow hunter culture. And so
they're definitely much more of the kind of people who will, they don't talk very much.
A slower, more deliberate talk, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's about doing the thing quickly, quietly, and if possible, you don't really even want to be observed doing it.
Goblins and gnomes are stereotypes. They're just straight up stereotypes. There is nothing that you can convince me otherwise of that. And I'll maybe toss this to Matt. I can't think of a good reason that they talk like they do, aside from being really fast and high strung. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's no lore reason for it. I would argue the only lore reason I could think of to explain the way that gnomes talk is that gnomes have literally evolved from literal machines. And so they went from talking in a kind of monotone but very quickly to convey as much information as possible to still talking very quickly, but now they're excited about everything. Everything is amazing. And it's not an accent, it's just hyperactivity. Which, as someone with ADHD, I have moments where I get up there, and then I have moments where I crash down. I feel like that's sort of represented in how gnomes talk. Goblins they're literally taking
they're Jersey Shore, right?
Yeah, they take a cartoonishly exaggerated version of the 30s Bugs Bunny, criminals who were all basically from New York or New Jersey, just a voice, and just make it more, and that's the Goblin.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's any in-game story other than the goblins were effectively elevated by Mimeron, who made the mechagnomes in his image and who then made him in their image later. So I feel like that's the only real connection lore-wise to why they both have the high speed thing. Because like the goblins would be talking fast to try and communicate with Mimeron at the beginning, because he would be asking them questions if they're an experiment. But then once he blew he was like, I don't need to, they just kept it because both groups have thoughts that pop into their heads and make machines out of it. The goblins, because they're drinking what might be old god brain juice, and the gnomes, because they have access to a huge database of information that they don't remember they have access. So yeah, I think in either case, there's very little in the lore to justify the way they talk, aside from this explains a characteristic these people have. It's not intended to be an accent, it's intended to be shorthand.
Yes. Going through that with Tauren, I think there is at least a case to be made for them being their speech is incredibly deliberate but incredibly thoughtful, and that's sort of their entire cultural basis, is not just being spiritual, but before the tumultuous events with Garrosh and the Grim Totem clan and everything else, the people in general, going back to Cairn and when we first met them, they weren't a quick to anger race. Their culture was, being one with nature, being nomadic, being present in that moment, but then thinking about what they're saying before they say it, being thoughtful. Volpera are just, I don't know how to describe them, because I don't think they really fit into any other trope, and I've never met anybody from a part of the world that I would even remotely equate to Volpera. And then you have the various elves of the world, which, again, high elves sort of have that high English sort of royalty thing going on, and then everything else sort of seems to fall from there, right? Like it's all drift or deviation from there.
I actually think there's a lot of various Asian cultures mixed up in Elven speech and in other things Elven in World of Warcraft. To the fact that they live in, Japanese style buildings. A lot of their clothing is either Japanese or Korean style. There's a good amount of straight up Korean or Chinese flavoring type stuff. Pandaria is very definitely draws from China a great deal, but there's actually other parts of Southeast Asia in there too. But you don't hear it much in the Pandaren dialect to speak. Their accent doesn't sound specifically like anything. It's very Kung Fu Panda.
Yeah, and I think that was deliberate too, and I think that was more of a design choice than a lore choice, because they didn't want to really step on anybody's toes, or really offend anybody for whatever they chose to go with Pandaren. But there's other ones that we could talk about too, that we could take an entire episode talking about it, because there are even the Highland dwarves, they talk differently. The Hanir, the Harnir, the Tuskar, the Vykrul, the Broken.
I could do an entire episode about just the fact that the same words in various Elven languages sometimes mean almost exactly the same thing, and sometimes don't.
Yeah.
And one example I could give you right off the top of my head, but we don't need to really go into it, is Quel Sarar versus Quel Zaram. In High Elven, Quel Zaram means the High Blade. In Darnassian, Quel Sarar means the High Blade. Quel stayed meaning high.
Mm-hmm.
But Sarar and Zaram are close enough that you could see why somebody saying Sarar could say it in a way that it became Zerar, which eventually became Zaram, just from linguistic drift. We know that happens with our own words, but it's still fascinating to look at it. It's always gotten to me.
Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what we think about the languages of Azeroth, where they started, both in reality and stereotype, and some of the World of Warcraft justification based off of geographic location. So we're going to move on to the next question here, which is from Mike. I was recently listening to your latest Lore Watch when I heard Matt speaking about the Arathi and noticed how all of them are High Elf. Well, we said half High Elven, but they definitely have that lineage. I was under the impression that Blizzard indicated in one of their interviews that the group of humans who left to create the Arathi Empire contained all 100 original mages who taught the humans magic. I don't know if I heard that, but also I thought that at least some of them stayed behind with the founding of Dalaran.
I was going to say, I thought that the 100 mages were involved in Dalaran, unless by that you mean the elves that came to teach them.
That's what I think. That's maybe what they mean.
See, because I know that the original 100 mages that got taught, I am positive at least some of them stayed in Dalaran. I don't know how many of the elves that taught us. In fact, for that matter, I don't know that it was 100 elves. I don't know how many showed up to teach. I just know that he wanted, I think he wanted 100 mages as his deal. Like they would teach 100 of his people to use magic.
Yes.
But yeah, that's interesting to think about. Like if it was the tutors, like after they got done teaching the humans, were like, nah, we're going to stick around with these guys for a while. I mean, that's entirely possible. I don't know. For an elf, the life of Thoradon would have been like, okay, he's dead? Oh yeah, you guys do that. Oh well, I guess we could hang out with you a little longer. I mean, we've really only been here for like 100 years. That's nothing. When we get done with this, we'll go back. And that just never happened. But, it's interesting to think about. I don't have an answer to it, though.
Yeah, I don't know that I have one either right now, but it is interesting to think about. And I think there are some other things that are, I don't want to say like fascinating about it, but one thing that I've been thinking about too is the idea of, were they all truly high elves? Were the elves that taught them all truly high elves? Because we know, at least in some part, that some of the Blue Dragonflight, if not all of the Blue Dragonflight, well, with some exceptions, we've met some that don't, that's a form they take. Like before Kalik, Kalik takes the form of a half-elven person with his ears being shorter, but other ones that we've dealt with are high-elven, right? Yeah,
but now think about, that wasn't very common in the Eastern Kingdom. Did Kalik take that form because he was at least spending some time over in the Arathi Empire?
He might, exactly. He might know more about that than we do. And why? Yeah. Some of those
For that
mages,
matter, all the dragons might. And just, they didn't feel like mentioning it because it really wasn't important to them to mention, oh yeah, there's other humans in other places, whatever.
Well, also they were a little preoccupied last expansion, so,
Yeah, they had their own stuff going on. But I do think that the fact that Kaligos has, as his visage form, a half-elf is interesting in this discussion because it implies that perhaps some of the elves that went over there were dragons. Perhaps Kaligos was one of them. Maybe he lived there for a while. It would explain why this person who ends up being the aspect of magic replacing Malygos wasn't around all that much before.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear about him during a lot of this stuff. I don't even know for sure how old Kalik is. I know he's not as old as, any of the aspects or their spouses or whatever, but he still seems to be at least a few thousand years old. And yet he's got almost nothing on him until the Sunwell. Did he come back because the Sunwell was in trouble? And that huge magical instability just demanded somebody of his caliber to show up and examine it? Like, what is going on? Where's all this magic? Why is this girl here? I don't know. It is interesting to think about. I hadn't really considered that until you said it.
Yeah, because part of it is just me thinking, like, one of the other things that I thought the Blue Dragonflight might be remotely interested in is watching what these 100 human mages that were taught how to use magic, what they do with it, right? Like, at least observe and report back. I think there might be an element of that because they were Sorry, go ahead.
Every time we've seen Malygos, that's been the kind of thing he would do.
Yeah, and the rest of the Blue Dragonflight as well, right? Because they were, when we meet Malygos, when we go and deal with him in Northrend with the Nexus, right? He's lost it, and what are they doing? They're pulling back all of the ley lines, trying to basically take magic back, right? And you don't do that without information, because even he's stating that, like, he's seen what people do with the magic. They've probably been observing this for a very, very, very long time. So there's a possibility that not all those elves were elves, or at least not all of the Arathi elves were elves. But we'll never know, or at least not yet. We'll find out eventually, I'm sure. But hopefully that gives you some answer.
Basic answer we can give you is we don't know, but here's some things we can speculate about.
Yeah.
I will, before we move on to another question, because I can feel you winding up. I will also say the other thing to think about is we've seen on the Dragon Isles that dragon nature seems to infuse everything.
Mm-hmm.
There are deer with dragony bits on them. There are, all these different animals who've got hey, look at that parrot, the one that breathes flame and has huge horns on its head. Yeah, that parrot.
Hey, that's a frog. Why does it have horns and is breathing flame as well?
Yeah. It's like, we make jokes of this kind of thing, but I'm going to say this one absolutely seriously. I feel like shape-shifting, super intelligent, practically immortal beings have a lot of time on their hands to experiment with things. And there's nothing keeping a dragon from being a big frog for like 5 months or whatever, just as a joke, or because he's interested in seeing their life cycle. And who knows, maybe he fertilized some eggs while he was down there. This is not something I feel like it can bear too much scrutiny, and I don't want this to turn into a Rule 69 type thing. But I do think it's worth considering, are there Arathi that are descended from dragons? And what would that look like?
Or are some of the elves that are still in the Arathi Empire, are they not actually elves? Because at the end of Dragonflight, when we're getting, the band back together, so to speak, what's one of the things that Calyx says?
Some people are too far away to get there.
Some people are too far away to get here, or maybe they can't hear the call, but definitely not all of them are accounted for. And so there's a possibility that they're still in the Arathi Empire. For all we know, the Emperor could be a blue dragon.
Or the Great Kairos could be. In fact, that might even explain why he didn't hear the call, because he was underground next to a gigantic pulsing light crystal thing. That's probably pretty hard to hear the call over, maybe.
Especially when they're in the middle of a war, because the Black Blood got active after Sargeras plunged the sword into the planet. They've been a little preoccupied. He might not have felt, especially if he feels obligated to the people there, which he definitely seems to, especially in the case of Farron, right? Like, he has a significant liking of Farron in a almost like a paternal way. He may not have wanted to go. He may have heard the call.
Mentorial. I can imagine saying, "There's like how many other dragons? I got them busy here. There's old god stuff. You guys can handle it. I got to deal with that.
You can deal with some ancient stuff. I'll deal with some ancient stuff. Everything will be fine."
Plus, we also know the blue dragons tend to be extremely independent.
Very much so. Yes.
More so than any other flight. I think they learned to be, because it's for so long they were almost wiped out, and Malagos was completely insane. So it's not like he could give them commands. I mean, look at even just Azuragos. Azuragos is straight up the most obdurate dragon in existence. You can directly call him to the Nexus to select the next aspect, and he just straight up doesn't come, because his girlfriend, who is possibly a Kyrian, is he's feuding with his girlfriend, so he's not leaving. Like, but this is very important. Yeah, whatever. Maybe if you get her to talk to me again, I'll leave. Like, seriously, Azuragos, I think blue dragons tend to be more independent and more independent-minded. So it's quite possible that there are blue dragons in the Arathi Empire who are just straight up not leaving because they're busy, or because they didn't hear the call, and even if they did, they're busy.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, and it's something that I've been thinking about since seeing this question. So thank you, Mike, because you sent me down a spiral. And now in my brain, like, there's at least one blue dragon just kind of high up in the Arathi Empire, just kind of chilling there, being like, I'm good. We just live real long time. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it too hard. It's okay. But we're going to move on to our next question here, and I think we have time for one more. And this is going to be coming from Ark Ree, who is a mage who is now working remotely. And mild spoilers here if you haven't done the opening stuff for this expansion. In the wake of the most recent destruction of Dalaran, I was thinking of how unfortunate it is that they spent rebuilding the city under that magic dome for somewhere during or directly after Warcraft 3 up to the Wrath of the Lich King, and now it's destroyed. Again. I was always under the impression that Dalaran was isolationist at the beginning of WoW, and I don't know if it's ever explained what made them decide to go from under a bubble to being our main hub in Northrend. I feel like it's easy to forget that Dalaran is one of the human kingdoms, and maybe one of the most active/meddling. Could we get a brief history in memoriam of our dearly destroyed flying fortress? They were definitely isolationists at the beginning of WoW. You went there and you died to the elementals. You were not allowed inside of that city.
They were isolationists during Warcraft 3.
They were absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, it was their isolation that got them destroyed then, too.
Yeah, so why did they decide to go to Northrend?
I think the World of Warcraft Mage manga kind of explains this, in that when Malygos first kind of came back to what you could describe as sanity, in that he seemed lucid and could talk again, he basically sent his servants to Dalaran, and at first the mages of Dalaran thought, oh, we're going to have conversations and discuss things, and then they started attacking. Mm-hmm. And the mages of Dalaran were like, wait, no, this isn't how we have a conversation. I mean, okay, it's how Jaina has conversations. Hey, no, but seriously, this isn't how we do this. Why are you attacking us? And he was like, your presence warps magic. This thing you're doing is terrifying. I don't trust you with it, and I'm going to, only those who serve me can be allowed to have access to it. So they basically were like, okay, we can't fight a war with Malygos from here. If he's going to be attacking us, he can just send people at us, and we can't do anything in return. We can't counterattack. So they moved the entire city up to Northrend, if I remember correctly. They moved the city up there so they could essentially be in striking distance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in that. And I think there's another thing that we just talked about that played a factor here as well. It's the ley lines. Like, again, what were the Blue Dragonflight doing during Wrath of the Lich King? While Arthas was doing his thing, the Blue Dragons are like, nope, we're going to rip all these back to the Nexus. Everything's going to come through here. This is going to be the focal point of everything. Nobody gets anything. We're going to control all things. And if you are the magical city of Dalaran, whose entire existence relies on that magic, your power starts to wane as those ley lines are ripped away. The loci of power around the world start to disappear. And this is over the course of years. So you notice this if you're in Age of Dalaran out in the world researching, and all of a sudden your particular area is like, well, I can't touch the weave anymore, or I can't tap into the arcane energies and make it do what I need to anymore. That's weird. I should check home. And then multiple, mages start coming back and reporting this. And then the Blue Dragons show up, and then you realize, oh, they're going nutso, and they're just going to try to take everything away. That's bad. Let's go and help. Like, they want to go to Northrend? Cool. They want to go fight the Lich King? Cool. We're going to be over here on the western side of the continent while you're dealing with that. But we'll take you up there. You can use our city because we need to be somewhere safe anyway. And hey, having a whole bunch of adventurers around in the city, probably going to be useful if a blue dragon shows up, lands on the city, and wants to pick a fight. That guy over there with the giant spiky plate mail armor, he might be useful in fighting a dragon. I'm pretty sure they've killed at least one blue dragon in the past. So probably can rely on that. So there's definitely motivation to allow them to sort of let us use them as a hub, because we're also providing them a service. Because what do we do before we go to Northrend, or before we go to Icecrown, right? We go and take care of the blue dragons for them. It's one of the first things you do if you're Alliance, right? I believe.
Even the Horde go there.
They do go there.
Yeah, the Horde. It tends to be. I don't know if in the lore of the game who officially kills Malygos, but I remember playing Horde, and you get, when you kill the last boss in Naxxramas, you get that needle thing that points to the eye. It didn't matter what faction you were. My Tauren got that quest.
Well, the Eye of Eternity was a joint faction. It was both.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so for the same reason. I think that you also have to keep in mind that if Malygos got his way, then every faction would have been crippled.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody would have lost the magic, except it didn't seem to be hurting the Scourge any.
And it also didn't really seem to be affecting druids and shaman, which for obvious reasons.
But it still would be a huge crippling to both factions at a time where they really couldn't.
Oh yeah, 100%. So yeah, I don't know if there's much else to add to it, because I think that really is like the encapsulation of the reasoning, right? Like all of these factors, all of this ticks those boxes. Anything else to add from your side, Matt?
I don't think so. I think it pretty much covers it. The only other thing I could think of in terms of why Dalaran would move to Northrend is because once they established they had the ability to do so, moving Dalaran around to deal with incoming threats just seems like a good move. It worked pretty well in Legion. It would have worked this time, except for the fact that it was all part of a trick by Xal'atath in the first place. If Xal'atath hadn't been doing that, they probably would have been useful to have Dalaran up there. It certainly was useful to her plans. So yeah, But before that, yeah, I think that they started doing it because it was working.
Yeah, and I mean it also the other thing to keep in mind too, like the waning of power, also moving it to Northrend also moves them closer to a bunch of loci of power.
Yeah,
so like
they're waiting a lot on ley lines going through the eye, and those means that they're on those ley lines. Even though he's pulling more to it, it doesn't immediately keep them from using it because they're right there.
And so it allows them to keep the city afloat, keep the bubble up, or defensive measures that they have, keep the wards active. It also lets them keep their magical prison intact. Because don't forget, that's the other thing too. The city had a magical prison in it, right? We go in there, we deal with some of the stuff that breaks out. But again, if all the magic fails, everything in there gets out. And some of the stuff in there was pretty nasty. Like, I can't remember all the things that were in there, but we have demons, we have constructs, we have extra dimensional beings. Like, there's a lot of stuff in there. Yeah. But like, again, also one of the other things that was in prison there was a void entity. Right? Zuramat the Obliterator was there. You also had an elemental warrior. You had an ethereal. You had all these things that were probably shouldn't get out. So keeping a lock on that door, probably a good idea. It just seemed like it would be a tactical advantage. I don't know how else to say it. But I think that's it, because I don't think we have time for another question. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add, or go back to any of our questions and add any last final thoughts?
I mean, I think in general, one of the things to consider with lore in World of Warcraft is always that it serves a ludonarrative and also a ludonarrative pull in terms of the constant struggle between gameplay and story. The story in a video game exists to serve gameplay. So sometimes things are just there because the players like them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's worth considering when you're asking questions like, how come these guys speak Scottish? They speak Scottish because people like it. It makes people happy. Look at how happy people are for dwarves when they are horrible looking in World of Warcraft. Like, oh my God. But people like the Scottish accents. People like a lot of the stuff. And I only mean the males, by the way. The females are great. But male dwarves, especially if they don't have facial hair. Oh my God, never have one without a beard. I have no idea why anyone would do that. But yeah, no, I think that is something that endears people, and that's not, making that part of the story is not wrong. It's not wrong to make decisions based entirely on what people like, because that's the whole point, is to feed the gameplay. And if people are happy playing their dwarf and enjoy it more because it talks in an outrageous accent and, drinks all the time, then that's great. And if they don't want to do that, you can play a Draenei and you could sound vaguely Eastern European. There's always something. There's lots of different options out there. So
yeah, and
I just keep that always in mind when asking questions like this. Is like, how does this bit of story serve gameplay? Because 9 times out of 10, that's going to be your answer.
Yeah, and again, the stereotypes and things like that are also, I hope we made that clear earlier, a lot of it is, paying homage to their influences when they started, writing their narrative. If you have a room full of D&D nerds, they're probably going to reference D&D tropes. If you have a bunch of people that were really into like eldritch horror stuff, they're probably going to sound very similar to stuff that like H.P. Lovecraft wrote, hopefully with less racism. You're
hard not to have less racism than H.P. Lovecraft.
I know. But you're you where your influence is. And like, and I encourage you to take a look if you are a content creator of any sort of like fantasy writing or anything like that, or you fancy yourself a storyteller, take a look at the stuff you write and really like just ingest it, right? And what are your influences? What are things that you like? And do you see elements of it in your writing? I know for a fact I certainly do. Like the things that I enjoyed, reading growing up or enjoyed watching, that stuff is all influential on the content I create. Even when I run a D&D game or when I, try to make a campaign or do anything like that, it's always influenced by those things. And like, it might be a movie, it might be a book, it might be something like that. And even if I don't intend for it to be like that, it's there. It's present. You can't avoid it. It's just kind of how stuff is created. But I think that's going to do it for us today, friends. Blizzard Watch is made possible due to the generous contributions at patreon.com/BlizzardWatch. Your continued support means that this podcast lighting community is able to thrive and grow. Blizzard Watch supporters enjoy exclusive benefits like early access to our podcast, a better chance at having your question answered on our podcast or the queue, and an ads-free site experience. Again, if you have questions for this or any of our podcasts, be sure to send those in to podcast@blizzardwatch.com. Specify the show that it is for and any special pronunciation of your name. If you don't want to send us an email, you can hit us up on Discord. We have the Q and Podcast Questions channel, which is open to everybody. And then we have the Patron Q and Podcast Questions channel as a way of saying thank you for our patrons. With that, folks, we'll catch you next week.